Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in Northern Virginia at the Air Force Association headquarters, where our offices also are, to talk to retired United States Air Force Lieutenant General Dave Deptula, who is the Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. Dave, thanks very, very much for the time. I know it was a very busy week for you that started out at the Air Force Academy and then ended back here in town. But also was a lot of sad news for everybody in the Air Force community on the passing of Lieutenant General George Muellner, a true giant, Vietnam War hero, test pilot, technical expert. I mean, the modern Air Force was built in part by George Muellner in terms of its capabilities and systems, and he was the longtime chairman of the Air Force Association as well. Also led up Boeing Phantom Works. Talk to us a little bit about what George Muellner meant to you, both as an airman, as somebody who's been an AFA member since you joined the Air Force from UVA. Tell us what George Muellner meant to you as an airman and as somebody who's been in the community for decades.
Well, Vago, that is a big order because George was bigger than life in many, many different ways. He was an operator, an operator's operator. As you alluded to, he flew in Vietnam. He was also an F-15 pilot. He was director of operations at Bitburg. I first got to know him when he began the JSF program, and I was on the Commission on Roles and Missions back in '94, '95. But prior to that, one of the things that stand out in his career is he was a program manager for JSTARS, and he brought JSTARS over to Operation Desert Storm before it had reached IOC. He stood up a squadron out there, and then he orchestrated its first combat use, where it became actually fundamental in allowing us to use air power to its maximum extent. But I digress, because there are so many things in his career that he was involved in, from stealth to initiatives that he talked about, new concepts of operation. He was a member of the Scientific Advisory Board. And essentially, he was a mentor to every airman that he ran into and ran across. He truly understood air power. He was motivated by it, and he dedicated his life to capitalizing on the virtues and values of air and space power throughout his entire career. As the chairman of AFA, I have a real close fondness for George, because essentially he brought me on board to resurrect and reinvigorate Mitchell Institute, because he understood the potential of what Mitchell Institute could do. And so it is with it's very sad that he passed away at such a young age, but he stands as a beacon, if you will, as an example of how airmen and officers who are in the Air Force can continue to contribute even after they retire. So he'll be duly missed.
He was a giant. I mean, I got to cover him from '92 when I first. Actually, it was roughly around the time when you and I met, all the way back then, and it was just an honor to cover him. He was always a gentleman, always very thoughtful, and I always was amazed at how there was always a solution. He always knew whether it was technical, military, strategic. He always saw the solution to problems. And he was 75 when he tragically passed away in Colorado, I think it was. California, I'm sorry. So let me ask you about a big event you had last week on nuclear command and control. Mitchell Institute released a report. It was standing room only in the room, which some people might not have seen if they were watching on a camera. Talk to us a little bit about the importance of the nuclear command and control enterprise. You know, you've used the Mitchell Institute to shine spotlights on each part of the aerospace enterprise that needs either upgrading, rethinking, operationally, or from an acquisition standpoint. Talk to us about what the most important takeaways from your report are.
Sure. Thanks very much for the opportunity. We did this report, by the way, in conjunction with MITRE Corporation, so it was not solely a Mitchell Institute report. The reason...
That's right, because Bill LaPlante was there from MITRE and a number of other luminaries.
And you know, Bill LaPlante was former head of Air Force Acquisition. We also had Admiral G.M. Bastiani, who's a former vice chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, someone I admire and respect very highly, a very not just gracious individual, but somebody who has insight along the lines that George Muellner did. And of course, his experience was in the Navy, but that's okay. We need all the services.
Submariners tend to get along better with airmen than other parts of the Navy sometimes do.
Whatever. The admiral's a wonderful individual, and he sits on the board at MITRE Corporation. So the purpose of the document is to highlight the importance of command and control. You hear a lot about the need to modernize and recapitalize our triad, our bomber leg, our land-based ICBM leg, and the sub-launched ballistic missile leg, and getting Columbia-class submarines on board. But you rarely hear about the command and control piece, the architecture that ties all of those weapon systems together, that provides the initial awareness of that we may be under virtual attack, to assure the connectivity, the communications necessary to make sure that the President of the United States has immediate and direct launch authority, as well as the other side of the spectrum to make sure that none of these weapons get employed unless absolutely necessary. Well, that command and control system basically is a 1960s architecture. It did have some upgrades, but many elements are still very, very old. So it is in critical need of restructuring. The problem with dealing with, and one of the reasons that nuclear command, control, and communications is not out there in the media, the press, people aren't talking about it that much, is because it is such a highly classified architecture. And so what we tried to do, you know, the readers can be the judge, but I encourage everyone to read the reports, not that long.
And it's also available online on the Mitchell Institute website, so you can download it in PDF form. So
right, but take a look at it, and it gets out in an unclassified fashion just what the nuclear command and control system does, what it's all about, and kind of highlights the importance of why it needs to be recapitalized.
And did you guys have a cost estimate in the report? I know that there have been a lot of discussion on what that piece of it would cost, right? I mean, we're in the B-61 upgrade. The Navy's going to be upgrading its ballistic missile submarines. The missile upgrade side has been done, and now the Air Force, you know, the B-21 is an important part of that, the new bomber, the Raider.
Don't forget LRSO.
And LRSO is also a key piece of that. And then on top of that, you have the GBSD, the ground-based strategic deterrent contract, which competition, which is ongoing between Northrop and Boeing. Talk to us a little bit about what the cost estimate for this piece of the program is going to be, given that it is such a hodgepodge, band-aided system that has been, you know, kept going rather than completely recapitalized.
Adjusted is probably a better term than band-aided, but that's okay. Okay. I know you want a figure, but I can't give you a figure because it depends on just what is included in the total amount, and it would be nothing more than a guess, and I'm not going to do that. But it will be a fraction of what the total cost of the overall upgrade of the triad will be. But the fact of the matter is, you know, number one on our nation's national security priority list is to ensure that nuclear weapons are never used. And in order to assure that that happens, deterrence is absolutely paramount. Well, to achieve effective nuclear deterrence, to make sure that those bad actors that are out there that have nuclear weapons don't use them, we have to have a very highly credible and usable command and control structure system. So that's why it's fundamental to the entire nuclear deterrent, and it's not just the weapons that need to be upgraded, but it's command and control as well.
And now let's talk about new, old airplanes. The United States Air Force has spent almost 20 years saying, I don't want any new, old airplanes. I want to go to the next generation of bomber. I want to go to the next generation of tanker. I want to go to the next generation of fighter aircraft, which is the F-35. And now the Air Force leadership seems to have made a U-turn in talking about acquiring new build Obviously, thoroughly updated F-15s. You were a combat qualified aviator at all ranks. You have a unique distinction of all the way from lieutenant all the way up to three-star to retain that certification. You were the second class of guys who went into the F-15 program in 1977.
Right out of undergraduate pilot training, yeah, as a lieutenant. So I flew the F-15 for 33 years. I was combat mission ready, every rank, as you mentioned, from lieutenant to lieutenant general. So I love the airplane. Got it.
Your son flew it for a while as well.
Yeah, correct. Matter of fact, we flew against each other in the F-15. But the fact of the matter is, it's time to move on. Wonderful airplane. By the way, the F-15X is an excellent airplane in the context of the new systems that it has, in the context of the number of weapons that it can carry. However, we need to put in context the kinds of systems that are required to meet the needs of the new national security strategy. And the priorities of the new national security strategy and national defense strategy are China and Russia, and the kinds of weapon systems that China and Russia are building and populating the adversary environment are ones that are specifically designed to defeat fourth-generation aircraft. And while you can improve the avionics, you can improve the weapons load, you can't make them low observable, which is a fundamental entry-level capability when you're going up against pure competitors. So, this is a very complex issue. It's an excellent airplane. If the Air Force's top-line budget is going to be increased, then, one might consider that, not a bad option to add to our overarching force structure. But the fact of the matter is, if you put in context the fact that resources are constrained, and fundamentally we've got a future where we may have already seen sort of the top line on defense budgets, and from here on out they may be going down. From a strategic perspective, isn't it wise to build more of what you actually need to accomplish your defense strategy as opposed to buying a new old airplane? And I think the answer to that is yes. So what might have to happen is, for all the good reasons that there are well-meaning people inside the Pentagon that are saying, yeah, we ought to build some of these. By the way, this is introducing a whole nother production line and a whole nother airplane, while this is an F-15X, new engines, different engines from the F-15s that we have, completely new set of avionics. So these were all different logistics lines as well. So what we need to do when we're looking at capitalizing on commonality is not adding some more differences, but capitalizing on what we know is going to be key to meeting the needs of our defense strategy, and plus up the F-35 line. We're only buying 48 a year. That number, as a minimum, ought to be 80, in my humble opinion. We ought to get there sooner rather than later.
But the Air Force leadership says not one penny will be diverted from the F-35 in order to buy these aircraft.
Well, let's look at, and as I mentioned before, I'm happy to consider the fact that if we get an increased Air Force top line, resources are constrained. I go back to the fact that finite amount of resources, you want to put your money into what you need the most of, and that's fifth generation capability.
Let me ask you.
By the way, let me just also add that. I was beginning to say there are well-meaning people in the Pentagon that want to do this for a variety of good reasons, but the fact of the matter is that Congress might have to interject themselves in this case and transfer any money for new old airplanes and put it into new airplanes.
How do you respond to those, however, who say, look, it's good we've got an F-22 force, we've got a bomber force, these are stealthy aircraft, the F-35 certainly we're going to have in numbers to be that sort of Hold on, let me get to the question. I'm with you. I've editorialized over the years that we should be getting to that fifth generation future for a vast array of reasons, whether it's phase 0 all the way up to the high end of the conflict, as we've seen with what F-22 can do over a battle space, and the fact that the adversary cannot see that is an incredible capability. But how do you respond to those who say, hey, just like the F-117 was the plane that came in and knocked the door down to allow fourth generation aircraft to get in there, maybe we need a bigger force of longer range fourth generation airplanes, and then we use the stealthy aircraft as that vanguard to knock the door down, to take out, to suppress enemy air defenses, to then be able to establish that kind of air dominance that you were one of the architects for in the first Gulf War.
Built that plan and built the attack plans for each and every day of Desert Storm. All right, so I got it. But that was in the last century, Vago. New adversaries have moved on. They learned the lessons of what it's like to provide access for the United States Air Force, the United States military writ large. And they're committed to making sure that we don't have that kind of access in the future. The future is very different from the past. And the notion that we're going to be able to, that an adversary is going to come up and unveil all of their capabilities and allow them to be destroyed the first 2 or 3 days of the war, no, they're not thinking that way. And it's not going to be the kind of a conflict that we saw in WW Desert Storm, or in Allied Force, or in Iraqi Freedom, or in Enduring Freedom. It is going to be a much, much more severe threat, and those threats will exist throughout the breadth and depth of the battle space from day one to the conclusion of the war. So that's my answer to those that still cling on to this Vietnam kick down the door construct, which saw its termination in the last century.
And you mentioned Vietnam, and just to bring this around full circle to General Muellner, for those people who didn't know, General Muellner was, just an extraordinary gentleman, an intellect, mentor to so many people. I was honored he pinned on my life membership pin as an AFA member, but that he was also a first-rate fighter pilot who'd also been shot down over Vietnam, which people don't sometimes recognize, and that was way before he went to test pilot school.
Right, absolutely. And so we don't want to repeat that kind of a situation where you take me back to Vietnam. Over 50% of the F-105 force was eliminated. We don't plan for that kind of attrition nowadays. And let me just take you back to the discussion point. 10 years ago, Secretary of Defense Bob Gates was talking about the rationale for why he terminated the F-22 at less than 50% of the military requirement, postulating that, hey, by 2020, we're going to have over 1,000 fifth-generation aircraft, and the Chinese won't have any. Well, guess what, folks? We're 10 months away from 2020. We only have about 180 F-22s. About the same number of F-35s. So we're about 800 shy of where Secretary Gates said we would be. And oh, by the way, he also said China wouldn't have any fifth-gen aircraft. They've got 2 fifth-gen fighters right now, and they're working on a fifth-generation bomber. So, those rosy predictions didn't pan out, and we have to adjust accordingly.
What do you think then? There is work on a 6th-generation fighter, obviously, that the Air Force has been working on for some time. So, this is a lot more of an advanced project, I think. We hope, and I know that you're privy to some of this, but how would you characterize what the capabilities have to be? You and I have had this conversation, but since you broached it, for that next-generation combat aircraft that the United States Air Force needs. We've got the bomber. But what kind, but the F-35 is a different airplane. It is a strike airplane. It doesn't have the altitude. It doesn't have, it has a whole bunch of positive features, but not for that high end of the mission. What does the next high end Air Force aircraft need to look like, or Joint Force aircraft need to look like?
Well, what I would tell you is that the next big thing, of which aircraft will be a part, is going to be based on the ubiquitous and seamless sharing of information. So we have to get behind or put these traditional notions of what airplanes used to be in the last century, and think about what their value will be in the future. And it's not just going to be about shooting down other airplanes or dropping bombs on a particular target that you force package a bunch of airplanes together to do. They're going to have to be able to sense, to assimilate information from a wide variety of different sources while moving at great speeds, and to be able to share that information and then employ the weapons, kinetic or non-kinetic, that they have to accomplish outcomes in a fashion much quicker than the adversary has an opportunity to either detect or react from. Now, I know that's a bit abstract, but it's much, much more than just going, a couple percent faster, higher, and a couple percent, a couple more bombs, a couple more missiles. So it's a completely different notion. Next generation air dominance, 6th gen, whatever you'd like to call it, is going to be a node in a system that will allow us to achieve the kind of connectivity and information sharing and effects-based application of non-lethal and lethal force to a degree much higher than we've ever thought about before.
Let me ask you one last question, not to drag this out, but I enjoy talking to you because we cover a lot of ground. You hosted the new, relatively new Chief of Staff of the French Air Force here at Mitchell Institute. Talk to us a little bit about his message, because the French Air Force is an incredibly innovative force, and several French chiefs of staff, Denis Mercier, who went on to become the Supreme Allied Commander Transformation, really seized on the combat cloud. You're also one of the proponents of that. His successor, Andre Lanata, did that, and now we have General Lanata's successor also talking a little bit about innovative concepts. What were some of the messages that you thought were most interesting that he presented to a Washington audience here?
Well, first, the one that he is committed to being part of and recognizes the importance of what I just talked about. That's seamless and ubiquitous sharing of information. So the airplanes that they're going to design, which are a little bit different, they're not going, the French and the Germans have signed a cooperation agreement to build a new fighter, all right, as opposed to coming on board with F-35. But when I've talked to my counterparts in Europe, I've emphasized the fact that you have to be able to have the interconnectivity so that we can continue this entire notion of building a combat cloud. And they get it, and they're committed toward it. And quite frankly, it's a little frustrating in the United States that each one of the services nods their heads up and down in this context, but we have to come up with a vision that each of the services buy into, not dictating particular routes that each of them go down, but to make sure that this concept is one that's adopted, and it's not just one that's adopted by one particular service, but every service and every ally. And I think the French get it, and they're on board with moving in that direction.
Well, and shout out to the French Air Force. They operationalized it over Mali and have continued to refine it in operation. So it's not just an experimental feature.
You bet.
Retired United States Air Force Lieutenant General Dave Deptula, Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. Sir, it's always a pleasure talking to you. Looking forward to seeing you at Air Warfare Symposium.
You bet. Take care. Thank you very much.